This is an absolutely fabulous chapter. I think one of my favourites in the Bible. And I know all of the Bible's inspired, and no bits are better than others. But you still have some favourites, don't you? And this is one of my absolute favourites. A fantastic mix of teaching, of example of how to approach someone with an understanding of what eternal life is about. And this beautiful imagery. Now, have any of you ever been really thirsty? Now, yeah, and you begin to feel it, don't you? There's a place where you're just sort of craving water. About 30 years ago, I took a group of students through the Sahara Desert. Not the sort of thing you can do these days with the security concerns. But we packed 20 of us into an old truck. It was actually an ex-police investigation mortuary. But anyway, that's beside the point. And drove off down through the desert. And, you see pictures of the desert, but when you've been driving literally for 200 miles across sand with nothing, and then suddenly, out of the middle of nowhere, there's this pipe emerging from the ground about 12 inches across, gushing water out of it. And this was just the most amazing experience. The middle of dry land, an oasis, water being pumped out. Everyone piles out of the truck. And suddenly you're sort of dancing in this water because you've been going through this dry, parched land. And I tell you, it was dry. That day I drank about 12 pints of water because I was thirsty enough to. Because of it was, August, middle of the Sahara Desert, sensible thing to do. No. But to come across this water, and the image that Jesus is drawing on here is simply that. The same as in our moments of thirst, as you find that thirst being met, as you drink something. Well, the same, Jesus says that what I do is I provide you with living water, which fills from the inside and touches you in ways which perhaps thirst and quenching that thirst is just the beginning of a picture of that. But this whole chapter, and there's too much for us to dig into this morning, but maybe in the house groups, those of you that go to home groups, you can look more at some of the themes from this. But it's amazing how these different themes are interwoven there, of the beauty of what God brings us in Jesus as he quenches our inner thirst. The training of the disciples, these wonderful people who are going to take the world by storm later, but at this stage in life seem to be a little bit inept, to be honest. How Jesus approaches a person and how he leads them to that understanding, starting from where they are, digging into their personal situation in a way which opens them up to the teaching of the gospel. And behind all this, in a way which perhaps few of us generally pick up, something of Jesus' absolutely radical rejection of all type of prejudice and the kind of way that society was constructed which kept people in slavery and kept them away from full realization as people that they should do. His total demolition of society's unjust construction as the way society is organized. And we'll look a little bit at that as we go through these. So anyway, Jesus and the Samaritan woman, fantastic story. Putting it in context, and the pictures I've chosen for today have got little to do with what I'm saying, except in as much as they depict women carrying water. Across the world, women are responsible for about 75% of the water that is carried from one place to another. And I can assure you, most of it, they do it in 20-kilogram canisters on their heads. Some of those who've been to different places will have seen this. That's the way the world is still organized. And so it's in honor to the women of the world who keep families going by their journeys backwards and forwards, carrying, as I say, about 75% of the world's water from one place to another. Context. We've seen something of Jesus at work in Jerusalem, how he overturned the temples, overturned tables in the temple, how he starts to speak, how there's the beginning of a movement of people talking about him, people inquiring. But of course the ministry that Jesus had caused upset and caused confrontation. And as the rumours started to grow and as opposition grew in Jerusalem, he withdrew from Jerusalem, from Judea, and went back to his home area in Galilee. Now, little map, sitting in context. Judea at the bottom, Galilee at the top, and what have you got in the middle? Samaria. Now, you could say you can get from Judea to Galilee without going through Samaria. But the way to do it is you have to cross the Jordan River and go up the right-hand side, the other side of the Jordan, which was Gentile territory. You see it says Perea and the Decapolis. Decapolis is simply Greek for 10 towns. It was a heavily colonized area with Greeks, with Gentiles. And so it's a bit like being between a rock and a hard place for a Jew. Don't any of you seen the Simpsons movie? That bit, the rock and the hard place? You remember that? Yeah, those that you know. If you haven't, look it up. Anyway, won't go there. What do you choose? You've either got Samaritans, who are almost worse than Gentiles, but maybe not quite. So the Jews made it, when they had to travel from Galilee down to Judea, they would go as fast as they can, with as little contact as possible. Gentiles were beyond the pale. The Samaritans were in some ways worse, because what they had done is they had mixed the traditions of Judaism with other teaching. And so they'd produced what Jews considered to be an unclean version of religion. And so they were nearly there, but weren't there. It's a bit like, historically, the wars of religions between Catholics and Protestants. A Catholic would probably find it harder to deal with a Protestant than they would with a Muslim. The Muslim's beyond the pale, but this one, he should be believing what I believe, but he doesn't quite. And so there's historically been a lot of tension. Well, that's what's happening between the Samaritans and the Jews. And the town they went to, this is a place called Sychar. It's on the route up there, where any of the Jews would have to travel. But as I say, they would go as fast as they can from one area to the other. Now that would certainly be what's in the disciples' minds. Get from A to B, like E.T. last week, you remember him? A to B, as fast as we can, with as little contact in the middle. But Jesus has something else in mind. Jesus' agenda is normally different to our own, and he's concerned with this place. So they stop there. Now Jesus has an issue. He has these disciples. And what do you do when you're surrounded by a bunch of people who haven't quite got it? They don't get it yet. Well, yes, they were tired from the journey, but was Jesus any more tired than the disciples? Had he been carrying them? Had they done a different journey? Why was he tired and they weren't? Well, I think they were all a bit tired from the journey. And you've just been walking for 6 hours, started up just after breakfast, 6 in the morning, you get there about noon, the sun's high. What do you want to do? Go for lunch. But Jesus chooses to send the disciples into the village to buy food. Maybe he's pushing them into some cross-cultural experience. You go and talk to these Samaritans. And he sits down by the well to wait. Now I think what's really going on in Jesus' mind here is he has to get the disciples out of the way. There are times when the disciples simply were unable to understand Jesus' agenda. And so they would do things. They would, like with the Syrophoenician woman, you may remember her, when they're up in a Gentile area, and she's coming saying, Lord, have mercy on me. And what's their complaint? Jesus, get rid of her. She's bothering us. Not Jesus, heal her. Jesus, get rid of her. Send her out of the way. Or when the kids are coming round, what do they say? Jesus, we don't like all this hubbub of kids round here. Just get rid of them. There were many times when the disciples failed to see the agenda that Jesus had. Once when he stopped, he's on his way to heal a synagogue leader's daughter. Important role. And a woman who's had a hemorrhage for 12 years comes and touches the edge of his garment. And he stops and says, who touched me? And the disciples, come on. Synagogue leader's waiting. How can you ask who's touched? You didn't see the crowd. Come on, you. Let's get going. They misunderstood what Jesus was about. And at this moment in time, I don't think there was any way the disciples had it in their capacity to understand what Jesus wanted to do and to be able to be with him in that moment. So the first thing he does is he gets rid of the disciples. Not because he doesn't need lunch himself, but because he knows there's an opportunity here for salvation, not just for this woman, but for the village as a whole. So he sends them off into the town. He has to, because as I say, the disciples have issues. They're not yet at that place where they're able to function in the same way that Jesus did as he relates to people like that. So he calmly sends them off. And there's an object lesson for them. When they come back, for example, let's just go back to this one actually, let's just stay here. When they come back, then if you've noticed, if you know the passage, if you've got a Bible open, just look at verse 27. It says, at that moment Jesus' disciples returned, and they were greatly surprised. What was their surprise? They found him talking to a woman. That's right. It's not just about Samaria. It's bad enough they've gone to Samaria, but I can assure you when they went to buy food in the shops, they'd have talked to men, not women. They come back and they are just horrified to see Jesus talking with a woman. The disciples at this moment were still prisoners of their own, the filters through which they viewed the world. And those filters classed women as second-class citizens. And a rabbi like Jesus had absolutely no business whatsoever to be talking with a woman. So they come back and they're surprised to see him doing this. So as I say, these issues meant they had to be got out of the way. When they come back, one of the things, the lessons that Jesus brings to them, and trying to wake them up to the reality that the gospel isn't just for us. The Jews were so centered on themselves, but he says, look at the harvest. And I suspect what Jesus is saying at that moment is he calls them to turn around and to look, because at that time, as the woman has gone back into the village and has said what's happened to her, and as the villagers starts to come out, I just imagine them streaming down the hill from the village to the well at the bottom of the hill. And he turns and says, look at the harvest. These Samaritans are your harvest, mates. Don't think it's just for us, it's just for the Jews. A quick trip from Judea to Galilee. Don't stop en route. Don't talk to anyone. You don't know what will happen. Dangerous people. The gospel is for them to look at the harvest. Relate to these people. And then he speaks about food. They say, aren't you hungry? Eat something. And he says, my food is to do the will of God. Now, it sounds a bit strange in some ways. We had an experience once. We were coming back from Portugal, been at a conference in Portugal, and we gave a young Norwegian guy a lift. He was coming to do a sort of placement in Spain with someone that we didn't actually know. And he was very spiritual. Very, very spiritual. When I met him that morning, I just asked him, I said, how old are you? He said, I'm 33. I looked at him and said, 33? He says, oh, you mean my physical age? 18. Oh, okay. Fine. Picked up his suitcases. Absolutely weighed a ton. Put them onto the roof and looked around. What have you got in here? He says, cassettes. All teaching. No, he says, kids are prepared for ministry like this. And we're sitting down having breakfast. And I said, you fancy some breakfast? He said, I already ate from the word. Absolutely real. Okay? I don't think there's any exaggeration in this. So somebody think, well, what's Jesus about? Didn't Jesus need to eat as well? Of course he did. But he's just trying to get a lesson across to these people. He feasted. He drank and ate as much as anyone else. But at this moment in time, he's saying to them, look, it's not about the food. My work is to do my Father's will. And at this moment in time, crossing this place, this woman and the community she represents, they are the people that I want to engage with. So don't just think about these other things. Try and discern God's agenda as you go through life. Look at the harvest. Connect with the harvest. Connect with the people that God wants to bless through your life. Yes, eat, drink, and be merry if you like, but not too much. But at the same time, don't lose what God's wanting to do through you. Back to this woman. He meets the woman as she comes to draw water from the well. And we'll get on to her in a little moment. I just want to focus on the offer that Jesus brings to her and the context in which he does it. Sometimes I find that our presentation of the gospel is divorced from reality. In the sense it's separated from the real issues that people are actually struggling with. It's like the Sunday school class, where the teacher says, what's small, browny grey, about this big and has a long bushy tail, and the child says, well, it sounds like a squirrel, but the answer is Jesus, because the answer is always Jesus. And sometimes what we give is just Jesus as an answer to every single situation without actually stopping and thinking and relating. It's not just Jesus, but it's the transformation that Jesus brings into our lives. And how he touches us and changes us and molds us and meets our specific needs. And the message of the gospel that we bring isn't a one-size-fits-all, but it has to relate to where people are at. And it has to connect with the felt needs that people have, even if it leads them to a deeper need, which at that moment in time they are not aware of, which is perhaps the case with this woman at this moment in time. She's come down there with her bucket to draw water from the well. And Jesus gives her an opportunity for something else. He speaks about living water. He speaks about something which will quench her thirst in a way that she perhaps can't imagine at this moment in time. Something which digs deep into the innermost longings that she has. And she speaks about this fresh, bubbling spring. Now, if you've ever drawn water from a well, you know it's not actually that easy. The woman's there, I'm sure she's skilled at it, but you've still got to be hauling kilo after kilo of water up from a relatively deep well. A spring's different. It gushes out. You don't have the back-breaking work of pulling up this heavy bucket. But instead of that, you're simply putting out your container and the water flows out into this. Now Jesus uses this theme that's there with her to draw her to that place of opening and saying, yes, I want this. And notice the other way that he does this is by making himself available to her in a way which perhaps is unusual as a Jewish man standing talking to her. We'll look at that a little bit more in a minute. Now, why is Jesus doing this? There's two things, and sometimes we say that God is expert at weaving all things together, don't we? It's like these wonderful banners, tapestries, whatever you call them. If you turn them over, what are they like on the other side, Viv? Don't go there. Okay. Sometimes what we see is the other side, but God is expert at weaving all these different things. Paul says in Romans, all things work together for good for those that love God and are called according to his purposes. And so he's able to join many, many things together. So when Jesus arrives here, he's giving an object lesson to the disciples. He's meeting this woman's need, but he's doing more than that, because behind that woman, she stands and represents a whole village. And I think that Jesus is aware not just of her need, and he wants to meet her need, but he's also looking for the best way into that community. We've looked at Jonah a couple of months ago, and we said how God chose Jonah. Maybe because he was the one who was going to say no and run off on a ship. So God could get him into the belly of a whale or a fish or whatever it was, a marine animal, for 3 days, get his body bleached white and then send him there as a living witness, a living example in himself of what God wanted to do. So God chose Jonah as the one individual who was important to reach the city of Nineveh. In the same way, when thinking of the village, the town of Sychar, and these Samaritans, Jesus knows that this woman is the one who will be the key, in many ways, to open up the whole of that community and bring them to a place of faith. So Jesus is not just about her. He's about them as well. But he understands that she is the way into that community. And what he does is he creates in her a miracle of transformation, which impacts that community in such a way that they're prepared then to come to Jesus and to listen for themselves. At the end of this passage, verse 42, the Samaritans say, well, as they hear Jesus himself, they say, well, at first we believed because of what the woman said, but now we believe because we've seen you and we've heard you for ourselves. That's a picture of what our lives are supposed to be. Transformation in our life somehow catches the attention of others around them and draws them to Jesus so that they will hear his words and believe on the back of what they've seen in us, but because of what they then hear from Jesus. Our lives, an open book. And we said this last week. Our life is the only gospel that many people will read. As they see our lives, they're drawn to Christ. That's what was happening through her. But one of the issues that Jesus had and that anyone has is how do you connect with people? I mean, there's various ways of doing it. You can try this. Sandwich board, turn or burn, the end is nigh, little bell in your hand, walking through Ormskirk High Street on a Saturday. Try it. How many people will you connect with? Probably not that many. Maybe some ones in white coats, a little van. I don't know. Jesus found a way to connect with this woman. He found a way into her life, and a way which opened her up to want to know more. And that's part of my prayer for us as individuals and as a church, that we can find these same ways to connect with people where they are. One of the first things that strikes her attention, as I say, is the fact that he was talking to a woman. You don't do that, do you? A Jewish man talking to a woman. So she approaches this at midday, thinking there's not going to be anyone there, and she finds this guy, rather shady guy, sitting there. She thinks, is it safe? She goes close, and he approaches her, and he speaks to her. The shock of that, first of all, is something which would have touched her, because of the deep-seated prejudice there still was, and the deep-seated rejection of women as a whole. And this brings us the question, why noon? Why is this woman drawing water at noon? Now, those of you that are familiar with the passage and have heard sermons, you'll probably have heard all sorts of things, probably something to do with this woman's dubious sexual morality. She's there at noon because she's a prostitute or someone who's slept around, someone who's rejected by the community because of this. Therefore, she keeps out of the way of the other women, and so she goes to draw water at noon because no one draws water at noon. The problem isn't drawing the water, the problem is carrying 20 kilos back. And that's why you go at daybreak or at the end of the day, because that's when you can carry the water. It's not the water isn't there at noon. She is there because she's trying to avoid people, but it's not, I don't think at any rate, to do with anything to do with dubious sexual morality. Jesus is not challenging her on the need to reform the way that she lives her life. He's dealing with her as a victim of a kind of society which has produced shame within her. She is ashamed of herself. She has been named and shamed by the community, and so she stands back from any contact with the other women. But what she needs, and this is what Jesus gives her, is not just living water for herself. She needs restoration as a whole individual. And she needs restoring to a place in the community where she is respected and loved and cared for. John Donne said, "No man is an island." And none of us can live separate from the communities into which God places us. She needed to have healing on social relationships, not just on her own internal needs. It's the same as the woman suffering with a hemorrhage for 12 years. Why did Jesus stop the procession? Why did he wait there? Someone's touched me. Who is it? Looks around. I felt power go out from me. Who was it? The woman touched his cloak and then tried to hide and run away. He refused to allow her that. Why? Because he wasn't just interested in her physical healing. He was interested in her social healing. He wanted her restored as a woman into that society. And a woman in Jewish society with any kind of issue of blood was not allowed to touch people. If I knew that a woman on her period has been sitting on that chair, I can't sit on that chair because it'll make me unclean. That woman was unclean and had lived isolated from other people for 12 years. She carried a label, permanently unclean. Don't go near me if you don't want to become unclean yourself. And Jesus won't allow that to continue. And so he smashes that label by forcing her to confess publicly and confirming her healing publicly. Now that's what Jesus is interested with this woman as well. It's not just about satisfying her thirst. It's restoring her in the village where she is. So he says to her in this, go call your husband. Now, she's in a bit of a dilemma now. Go call your husband. She says, I haven't got one. And then he says, you're absolutely right, you haven't got one. You've had 5, haven't you? And the one you're with now isn't your husband, is he? Is he? Now, how do you read that? There's so much in intonation, in the background information we put in the looks that are there. You've had 5, haven't you? And the one you're with now, he's not your husband, is he? Imagine the woman. No, he's not. Or, I know. You've had 5, haven't you? 5 men who have passed you from one to the other, who have divorced you one after the other, and now because you've been so used and abused, no one else is prepared to marry you. And so this guy's taken you in, but he won't even have the decency to marry you. I know what that feels like. Very, very different picture. And you have to understand that though she's been married 5 times, she's not a prostitute. Prostitutes didn't get married, and certainly didn't get married again. If you're a prostitute, your reputation goes before you. No one will marry you. Been married and divorced, married and rejected 5 times. You need to understand the concept of marriage that there was at that time. And forgive the imagery, a wife is a garden. A wife, I buy a field. I buy somewhere to plant my seed and to raise a crop for myself. My wife is the mother of my heirs, preferably male heirs if possible. That is her usefulness. And if she is unable to have children, then she's useless to me as a husband. Because I need someone to produce heirs for me. So if I marry a woman and she can't have kids, then that is sufficient reason to divorce her. You know, when Jesus goes into the whole divorce debate, and whenever you interpret Jesus' teaching on divorce, you have to put it into the context of what the Old Testament teaches. Jesus was speaking very specifically about a debate going on between 2 rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, and their interpretation of a passage in Deuteronomy, which says if a man finds fault in his wife, then he can divorce her. What does that mean? Anything is what it says, or any word in the Hebrew. What does that mean? Some of the rabbis, particularly Shammai, interpret that as anything. She's burnt your toast in the morning. That's sufficient reason to divorce her. But Hillel, another school of rabbinical thought, said no, the kind of fault that Moses is referring to there is sexual unfaithfulness. So Jesus jumps into that debate on the side of Hillel, but he's not, by doing that, disqualifying the whole of the Old Testament teaching on divorce. Whenever you interpret what Jesus says, you have to put it back into that wider context, otherwise you will misunderstand what Jesus is saying about divorce. But for a Jew at that time, childlessness, sterility, infertility on the part of a woman was sufficient reason to be able to divorce her. And I think that's what this woman was at. She was a place where she had no children. And if you have no children as a woman, then you're rejected by your husband. What then? There's no social security. There's no social protection. You know the place of children in caring for aged parents? What did Jesus do? His last words on the cross. As Mary stands there and the disciple John there, he speaks to Mary and says, "There is your son." And speaks to John and says, "There is your mother." As he's leaving this world, he tries to ensure that his mother will have social protection and places her under the care of someone else. That's what children were. This woman, as she's divorced and passed from husband to husband, she has no social protection whatsoever until finally she meets someone who's prepared to take her under their wing. She's vulnerable. She's lost in that sense. She doesn't have the kind of security that she needs. And so eventually, after going through 5 husbands, no one else prepared to marry her, she comes under the wing of this one man who, as I say, doesn't even have the decency to marry her. He takes her and says, "If you like, I'll give you board and lodgings in return for sexual favours and a bit of housekeeping." And that's her situation. Shamed by being childless, shamed by being divorced 5 times, and shamed by now living with a man who doesn't even have the decency to marry her. Jesus speaks to her and speaks into her need. She was a victim in a man's world. And Jesus won't have that. Jesus overturns that kind of social, I was going to say suicide, but it's the opposite. It's the aggression against women and against this woman in particular. And he's simply not having any of that. So he chooses her to become the messenger of the Messiah and sends her back to the village with that kind of understanding. Now this is absolutely fantastic. That woman goes back into the town with a burden lifted off her. And this is, the Messiah. They're waiting for the Messiah. Some of their conversations, you didn't exactly have all the information around, but they're waiting for the Messiah. The Messiah comes to little Sychar in Samaria. And who does the Messiah talk to? Not their own version of the synagogue chief, not their leaders, none of those people, not the important ones, not the rich ones. He talks to this vulnerable woman outcast and makes her into the messenger of life going back into the village. So she hurries back in there and is able to share with a freedom and with personal restoration that she's never had because the Messiah came looking for her. Now I think she's an object of what God does with each one of us. The Messiah comes looking for each of us. He touches us in our own point of need. He speaks into our own rejection, our own hurt, our own pain. And he offers us his own embrace as a way of restoring us and freeing us and setting us on a course where we go back into the community. Now, just a few applications, 3 applications to finish with. Firstly, as a church, please, let's not perpetuate the social injustice which is part of the world around us. I think as Jesus stepped out and refused to accept the limitations that were put on him by a male-dominated society, I think we as a church also need to be prepared to stand up and be counted and to reject any kind of injustice that's out there. Put ourselves on the line as Jesus did in that way in order to see something new happening and to see the victims of injustice coming back to a place of freedom. Also that, for ourselves, let's drink deeply of the water that Jesus offers. That's one of the main themes through this story. Jesus offers living water for each one of us. Don't have to dig a deep well. You just come to the fountain. He will meet your need. Your need today, whatever it is. That's where he will come and meet you. Drink deeply from the well that is Jesus. And finally, we're meant to be as Jesus did. Learn to connect. Don't preach at people. Don't hide. Don't just go and have your dinner. Learn to connect with people. Seek out the opportunities to bring healing, restoration, and the message of life-giving water to people by connecting with them where they are and leading them to that place where they're able to meet with Jesus. Thank you.